All right, welcome. This is Regime Change Recaps, the podcast version of my Substack series, where I've been digging into the U.S. influence in regime change efforts since 1997, which conveniently is also the year that I was born, August 23rd, 1997 to be specific. Same birthday as Lil Yachty, same birthday as Kobe Bryant, same birthday as Jeremy Lin, and also the same birthday as Julian Casablancas of the Strokes. So, pretty cool if you ask me. Now, we're going to conveniently look at that year, and we're going to start from 1997 and kind of go along because I grew up along some of these revolutions. And so far, we've covered 9 separate cases. We've looked at Montenegro, we've looked at Armenia, Slovakia, Serbia, the Philippines, Madagascar, Venezuela, Georgia, and Ukraine. So we have a bunch of different regions we're looking at, different politics, different cultures. But once you start to line them up side by side, we're seeing a lot of the same things, a similar pattern kind of emerging, if you will, where we have similar tactics, the same pressure points, reoccurring sequences of events. So it's less like scattered random history and more like a recognizable kind of formula. And today we're going to zoom out. This episode is going to be looking at those patterns, the unofficial regime change playbook that we will, that continues to show up between 1997 and all the way up until 2004. So I guess the best way to start here is going to be our first theme, and we're going to be looking at the media and the role that it plays in some of these revolutions. So media isn't just covering these movements, it's really actively kind of shaping them. And in nearly every case, state media backs the government while you have private or opposition media that becomes the megaphone, if you will, for some of these protest movements. So when you're looking at Serbia in 2000, with Radio B92, it is repeatedly shut down by the government over and over again. And yet it keeps broadcasting throughout it all and discusses the election in the run-up to it. And when you get to Georgia by 2003, Rustavi 2 is airing the exit polls, showing the opposition leading, and it's even documenting the fall of a dictator, the very influential film that came out during Serbia in 2000. And this is where we start to see some of those patterns go into later revolutions, where, according to reports in the Ukrainian Weekly, individuals were even sent from the station to Ukraine to advise on media strategy for the next year. Pretty crazy, if you ask me. And then in the Philippines in 2001, we're really looking more so at private networks here, text messaging, to amplify protests against Joseph Estrada, where we're using things like humor and really kind of the first use of memes, keeping morale high, which is a tactic that we really saw a lot with Serbia's Otpor movement, where nonviolence and humor played a very important role in that revolution. Then when we have Montenegro, we're having some more kind of weaker independent media, some opposition visuals and messaging, really not quite as influential as we see in these later kind of revolutions. But the key part of a lot of these is that they survive on Western funding and NGO funding. We're mainly looking at USAID and similar organizations to help fund some of these organizations. So the media is really not remaining neutral. It's a part of the revolution. And if we're looking at Georgia and Ukraine specifically, there's a book I cannot recommend more. It's excellent. And it's Mark McKinnon's The New Cold War. He was actually in Moscow during these revolutions, and he has this really great nuanced coverage where he's able to get these very exclusive interviews that you're really not going to see anywhere else, where you have members of Otpor, you have members of OK98's campaign, and they are giving very explicit directions and quotes that have been super useful throughout my writing so far on those specific chapters. Now, when we start to look at number 2, we have the theme of security forces and where they're actually switching sides. So the movements are gaining momentum when security forces hesitate or defect. And when that key inflection point happens, that is where the revolution kind of takes a turn. So if we're looking at Serbia in 2000, some of the police refused to crush the protests, and some even joined the demonstrators. And then when you're looking at the Philippines in 2001, the top military leadership withdraws their support for Joseph Estrada on live TV. After that, it's game over. The revolution's over. And in 2003, in Georgia, the security units hesitate, and it enables the rise of Saakashvili. Did I say that good? Thank you. And then when we have Ukraine in 2004, violence almost erupted on the night of November 28th And in Matt Kinnon's book, he reports that 10,000 soldiers were armed with live ammunition, and that really it was diplomatic efforts that helped save it all in the end to prevent bloodshed. Just showing how fragile these movements really can be. In just a few seconds, the whole country can be changed. And so when some of this doesn't happen, the movements often fail. So if we're looking at Venezuela, for example, in 2002, it really helps to illustrate that, where units backing the coup flip and the coup collapses, where nonviolent protest makes it easier to sway the security forces and they appear non-threatening, and violent suppression becomes politically costly. And then this is another very big one here. For theme number 3, we're going to be looking at the youth movements and the NGOs. And they almost kind of go hand in hand sometimes in some of these revolutions as well. And so if we're looking at the media as kind of that megaphone, the youth movements are the engine that kind of amplified that message. So I think the biggest one here, once again, is going to be Serbia's Otpor. They are what I would consider the origin, the starting point, the alpha, the omega of the revolutions, where they rely on funny slogans. They talk about branding, the low-risk actions, using stickers and graffiti, gradually building that momentum. They refer to their logo. They want it to be as recognizable as Coca-Cola was. And you can really see that because the logo from Serbia's Otpor is almost identical to Georgia's Chimera. And as we go along into Ukraine, we also see it with Pora, where we start to see logos taking kind of center stage. And when we get to Georgia, it's modeled directly off of Otpor in the training, funding from Western democracy programs as well. Notably, Pavlo Dimas from OK98, I don't know if I said that name right, I tried my best. In Slovakia, he created a PDF guide for Georgia's revolution, which you can view online, and is showing how some of these tactics were transferred from one movement to another. It also has a timeline, which I will say, I do not know how accurate it is. I've not been able to independently verify a lot of the claims in there, so take that for what you will. Now, once we get to Ukraine 2004, the activists start to leverage the same tactics. We have branding, nonviolence, humor, youth engagement to mobilize the participation in the Orange Revolution. And these groups do appear grassroots, and I don't want to take that away from some of these movements, especially when we're looking at the case of Madagascar, if we're looking at the case of the Philippines. But we'll get more to those ones in a little bit. These groups, especially when we're looking at Serbia, we're looking at Georgia, and we're looking at Ukraine, there is definitely genuine support, but the infrastructure often has some international backing in some way, shape, and form. And the same playbook is traveling across these countries, across different languages, and across different representations, as it were. Then, when we get to our next one, this is just the very obvious one, the elections playing a very important role. And so in a lot of these different regime changes, you're going to see a lot of election fraud. Especially, I want to say, in the Armenia article, I pointed out where this one district, I believe it was over 800% of people voted in that particular district, just to show how extreme some of these can be. But fraud, or even the perception of fraud, can often spark some of these mass protests. So when we're looking at Serbia in 2000, the parallel vote count showed that Milosevic lost. Georgia, 2003, we have exit polls versus the official results, which creates that legitimacy crisis, with Rustavi 2 providing the coverage for the opposition. Ukraine, 2004, we have election manipulation in the run-up to the Orange Revolution, which fuels public outrage, and the media coverage emphasizes transparency and nonviolence. And when it comes to Ukraine, we had 3 separate runoffs for the election, which we have a pretty humorous quote from Vladimir Putin, where he is asking, how many elections are we going to have? We're going to have like up to 25 different elections? Are we just going to keep doing this? So I found that a funny little tidbit there. So the international observers like the OSCE give opposition movements credibility when they flag irregularities. Elections aren't endpoints. They're often the flashpoints where things really start to change. Now we get to the juicy stuff. This is the stuff people love talking about when it comes to these revolutions. So theme 5, this is the Western influence. And it's not always overt, but it is consistent, where we see funding, training, diplomatic pressure, rapid recognition of the post-regime governments. So I kind of lumped some of these ones in, but when we're looking at places like Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, you're going to see a lot of very familiar names. You're going to see USAID. You're going to see the NED. You're going to see the IRI. These are just some of the very many organizations that you'll see involved in these different regime changes. And when you start to get to 2003 in Georgia, Open Societies Foundations and the State Department plays a really crucial role in the Rose Revolution as well. And I do make a point in my Georgia 2003 article to point that I want to be very fair with some of these influences and some of the sourcing. And so I'm getting very specific. Here is where this money is coming from. Here is where this specific quote that we have. So there are no claims that I have in these articles that are not backed up, where I can see, boom, this is how much USAID is giving. Boom, this is how much the Soros Foundations are giving. So just thought I'd mention that here. If I can't verify it in a few different sources, odds are I'm not putting it in there, because I like to have credible sources so that way I can form a good picture. And also that way, for my readers, I want you to be able to trust me and know that, hey, I've got this information from a credible source that I myself, I'm not going to put out any fake information and things like that. So I want you to be someone who I hyperlink so much in my articles. Some people might say it's overkill, but I think it's important to have that credibility as a journalist. So little tidbit for you there. All right, where were we? Ukraine, 2004. So this is where the Western organizations are providing funding and training for civil society groups and youth movements, continuing to reinforce that idea of the nonviolent, media-friendly tactics that mirror some of those earlier cases. Now, some revolutions, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, like in Madagascar and the Philippines, they relied more on monetary support, with the aid coming with like a rule. If you don't follow certain frameworks, you don't get U.S. financing. So in a sense, it is Western influence, but it's definitely a lot less hands-on than if we're looking at Serbia, if we're looking at Georgia, if we're looking at Ukraine. And there's debate about motives, but the available evidence shows a structured long-term involvement rather than just instant orchestration in some of these cases. Now, theme number 6, I think, is very important, and this leads to discussions of some of those grassroots kind of movements. So we're looking here, there are definitely genuine grievances that fuel these movements. There's sanctions, corruption, energy crises, financial scandals, oil and labor conflicts. They all create an environment that is ripe for some of these protest movements to really get started in the first place. So when we're looking at Serbia, the economic collapse adds to a lot of that dissatisfaction that we're seeing. With Georgia, there's a lot of energy crises and corruption. In the Philippines, we're seeing financial scandals, and we're also seeing corruption, which is also then trying to be covered up by people in the Philippines government. And then Arroyo, who comes in after Estrada, also has corruption. So, as you can see, a running theme there as well. With Venezuela, we're seeing oil and labor disputes. And with Ukraine, we're seeing really widespread economic hardship, a lot of amplified anger, creating the ground for some of those mobilizations that we come to see in that country. When we're looking at the next theme here, we're looking at some of that nonviolent branding, what we talked about a little bit earlier, but I figured I would just kind of recap it here a little bit more as well. So giving us that visual identity and that nonviolence makes protests media friendly, encouraging middle class kind of participation and making the crackdowns look worse. So when you're looking at Serbia, we have that clenched fist logo, which, as I said earlier, they're trying to make it like Coca-Cola. With Georgia, roses are symbolizing change, and roses are something that I have seen a lot between Ukraine, between Georgia, and even when I started working on my Lebanon chapter with the Cedar Revolution, there's been mentions of roses. So roses, I think, plays a very key role in some of these nonviolent protests. Then with the Philippines, especially in the EDSA movement in 1986, we see yellow as a symbol of regime change. So kind of matching that color theme as well. 2001, there wasn't so much a color along with it, but this was also referred to as EDSA 2, which is kind of a continuation of a nonviolent protest, which is what we saw to get Marcos out in 1986. And then we go to Ukraine, the Orange Revolution branding, emphasizing nonviolent resistance. We have humor. We have that youth engagement. So the nonviolence isn't only moral, it's more so looking at it from a strategic lens, as you were. So in the aftermath of it all, winning the streets doesn't really fix the system, where the post-revolution governments, they face corruption, instability, or new conflicts. So looking at some of these ones, one of the ones we haven't really talked about too much in this particular podcast, But we have Armenia, where there is a lot of hope for bipartisan support, where it seems like the different factions are coming together in a hopeful way. And unfortunately, that gets dashed pretty quickly as there is a political assassination. So all the hopes get dashed pretty quickly, unfortunately, in Armenia. When we are looking at Serbia, when we're looking at Georgia, when we're looking at Madagascar, there are those leadership changes, but a lot of those challenges continue to persist, especially if you're looking at Georgia with Saakashvili. One of the most important things I think to point out is the later wars that we have in Georgia, where Georgia is attacking Russia, where we also have the prison abuse, a lot of really horrible things that happened in that case. And then when we get to the Philippines, we have Estrada, who is being removed for corruption. And as I said, Arroyo replaces him, but we are seeing a lot of those same things, a lot of those corruption charges that we saw against him. We're seeing once again just with a new person in charge. And then Ukraine post-Orange Revolution, the government is facing ongoing political friction and regional tensions, showing that regime change is just kind of the beginning of a messier reform process, especially because who we saw lose in the 2004 Orange Revolution was Viktor Yanukovych. And then he is someone who comes into play a lot more prominently once we get to 2014. So the person who loses in that year does not necessarily go away. He reappears very soon after. So when we line up these cases and we see some of the things put together, like the media amplification, like the youth mobilizing, with elections as kind of those flashpoints, the security forces hesitating, Western backing, economic concerns, the nonviolent branding, and a complicated aftermath, we have a pretty consistent and a pretty recognizable model here. So it's not really a secret conspiracy, but it's more of a formula that's been repeated across the regions in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And I'll say it again, for those who are interested in this, you absolutely need to read Georgia and Ukraine. For people who are very interested, you have to read Mark McKinnon's book, The New Cold War, about Georgia and Ukraine. It's really essential reading. So many good quotes. And it's a short read as well, and provides just greater context about what's happening in some of these post-Soviet states in the time period, and shows how media and strategic nonviolence shaped both of those revolutions in real time. So soon we're going to be diving into Lebanon. I will say, this is just giving a little bit of a sneak peek, as it were. This article has been one of the tougher ones to produce, honestly. I think once I was able to find the Ukrainian Weekly, as well as the Kiev Post, I think that the full story of the Orange Revolution became a lot easier to produce when I had those sources. Of course, I was also using different State Department articles. I was using The Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post, the LA Times, all sorts of different sources. But when it comes to Lebanon, there are tons and tons of newspapers that were used at the time. But unfortunately, a lot of them did not get to see the light of day, where now, even using archive.org, you're not able to find a lot of these things. So this article has definitely been a tough one to produce. I'm still putting together a lot of the story. On top of it, the history between Lebanon and Syria goes back quite a bit. We're talking about like the early 1900s. So I start there, which means the background section may be a little bit longer than I would like it to be. So right now I'm working on kind of shortening that up a little bit. For the most part, I've got some important characters and people involved in the protests. When we're looking at the foreign influence section, I think I'm really starting to get a hang of the players involved here. But I really want to flesh out the whole story. That's always how it's been with these articles that I've been working on. I want to get the full story. I want to figure out from multiple different sources what specifically is happening. And then the aftermath section as well. I was able to find some really good WikiLeaks information from different cables that came out around this time period, and also a reflection of the time period. So hopefully that's something that people are very interested in, because we're going to keep going with this series. It's recently gotten a lot of eyes on it. I've also been offered to work on, potentially working on a book in the future. I think that would be amazing. But this stuff has just been really fascinating to me, and I hope to continue working on it. And I hope you guys really enjoy this. This is the first podcast that I've done. So if I sound boring, I'm sorry. I'm trying my best. But we'll continue going. I would love to hear what you guys think about this podcast. Also, what ideas do you want to see for future podcasts? I've also floated out the idea of me doing some of those weekly updates through this format. I was very ambitious when I first started the Substack and said, I'm going to do weekly updates where I look at my 3 top stories from the week and I'm going to do analyzation of it and everything. And then you come to realize, man, there is a lot of work that goes into this, especially because this is not my full-time job. This is just something I like to do for fun. So just leave a comment on what kind of material you would like to see in the future here. I am down to really tackle just about anything. I could even do a Q&A here. You could ask questions and then we could do a response here. So that is up to you, the listener. So if you've made it this far and you have not been annoyed with my voice, thank you. This has been the Anatomy of a Regime Change podcast, where we've dove into some of those themes that we're looking at across these different movements throughout the years. This one specifically, recapping 1997 up until 2004. If you enjoyed this, please share it with others. And as I said, let me know what you'd like to hear in the future. And we'll wrap it up there.